Shall I start? Are we ready?
Go for it.
What are we doing here, guys? Hello, everyone, and welcome. Well, you're already here. Welcome again to Sci-Fi in the Sky. I am Dr. Squee, and I'll be taking you through this next hour and this panel. And don't think, just because we're coming from my studio in Southampton, we're not going to be all glitz and glamour. So, hey! And that's the glitz and glamour gone. But we're here to bring you a great interview today. So we're now going to welcome Mr. Dacre Stoker. How are you doing today, sir?
Well, Squee, I'm doing just fine. I'm coming for you from South Carolina, and I don't have a whole lot of glitz either. I'll leave that up to you. But I look forward to this interview. Wish I could be over in the UK with you, but I'm suffering in sunny South Carolina in the US right now. But all is good.
I've got a second party popper in case we get desperate. That's all I'm saying.
Okay.
But sir, so like obviously, for anyone who doesn't know, Dacre here is the great grand nephew of Bram Stoker, the man behind Dracula originally, as well as being a fantastic author in your own right. You've also done research into your great granduncle, forensically going through his life, and the amount of stuff you've uncovered is amazing. As well as being an Olympic coach and athlete. I mean, how many strings does one man need to his bow, sir?
Well, I guess maybe there's something about maybe being a little bit ADD. I got to keep moving, and I love to stay busy. And as my life progressed from being a school teacher and teaching all sorts of kids all day long, when I wound that down, I got into research of writing all about Bram Stoker. I couldn't put the sport away, and so I sort of got back involved in real tennis. So that's still a piece of me because I like to stay physically active, but also the mental side of digging into, as you mentioned, forensically into Bram, visiting museums, libraries, cool archives, digging on Google, finding out things about Bram Stoker and his writing of Dracula that nobody's ever found before has been very, very fulfilling.
Yeah, well, I do want to get into all of that and so much more. And for everyone watching, just to let you know, because Dacre has got so much wealth of things to talk about, both Bram and him related, we're going to perhaps two parts of this. So we're going to do this on the Sci-Fi in the Sky today, and then we're going to bring you a part two on the Dr. Squee Show, which is my podcast, which will be broadcast on Facebook Live. But I'll post that all in the Weekenders group, just because we want to make sure we can get through everything and not kind of be rushing through it all. But to start off with, though, I wanted to hear about how you first kind of like were made aware of who your great-granduncle was. Was it something which was talked about when you were a child? Was it just something which was always present?
Well, it's I get this question a lot, and I think if you were to poll a number of people who had famous relatives who are long gone, their memory is there, but a lot of information is not. We're sort of reliant in the family upon people that have done good biographical work. Bram didn't write an autobiography, so we're sort of in the hands of biographers. McNally and Florescu was the first book I read when I was in university. So way back in the late 70s is how I learned more about Bram Stoker than my father told me. But there is sort of a cool story that is a family related. I was about 12 growing up in Montreal, Canada, and of course we celebrate Halloween in a big way. And I know in UK it's now pretty big as well. But people come to the house, and in those days they used to come to our house and joke, "Ooh, if they go to the Stokers, are you going to take our blood or give us candy?" Yeah. And after a while I got sort of bored with that, and I said, "Dad, what is that all about?" And he went down to the library and pulled out this book. And it was a first edition of Dracula.
Now, the library, I like to think you had to go into a cellar and it was cobwebs everywhere. And, please say that there was the effects around it.
Okay, we lived like the Addams family and the Munsters, if you want to believe that. But reality, very boring. He just went downstairs and pulled this book off the shelf. And it was a first edition, but it was signed by Bram to his mother and then passed on from the mother to one of Bram's other brothers. And so we had this sort of chronology, which was really cool. And I said, "Dad, how did you get this?" He said, "I really don't know." Because, of course, his grandfather was Bram's youngest brother. So somehow it must have arrived in a box of things. And we've ended up with, and I actually am the custodian of it now. I loan it to museums when they're doing, displays of Dracula. And I actually, embarrassed to say, I tried reading it at the age of 12. And it's a very difficult book to read at the age of 12. I didn't quite understand it till I read it again in university. And that's sort of when I was at the height of my, teaching, learning to become a teacher and training for sport. So it didn't have a big impact on me. This life of the dark side, that wasn't really until the 2000s when I decided to really get into the writing and seriously start digging into his life. So as a child, I was aware of it. Every Halloween heightened the awareness, but that was just sort of on the periphery.
And I guess there's kind of different strands to the story. So you're aware of it there, and then you go off and you have this wonderful career in sports. Can you tell us a bit about that? And
it was an interesting start. My dad was actually in charge of the equine drug testing at the 1976 Olympics when they were just beginning to drug test for horses. And my sister and I and my friends, we were all horse people. So we got the job as being assistants to the drug testers. We had to actually escort the horses from the end of the competition site up to the drug testing barn. And my claim to fame was I got to escort Princess Anne and the groom and her horse to make sure that they didn't switch horses, so that you had maybe a drugged horse and you switched in with a non-drugged horse to get the urine sample.
How would you sneak in a horse?
People switch, they go off somewhere behind the bushes and switch another one. Listen, nowadays we know how sneaky people are with drug testing and urine samples and all these things that the Russians and everybody else has done. But I got to see modern pentathlon at the Montreal Olympics as a sort of 16-year-old athlete. And I saw that these guys, I could ride horses better than they could. And I thought, well, out of 5 sports, I can already do one better than Olympians. And I got the bug from watching all these great athletes in 76. So I devoted the next sort of 12 years of my life. And I actually ended up making the team for Canada in modern pentathlon for the 80 Olympics, but those were the boycotted ones. And then I got a real job as a teacher, and I just couldn't train enough. So I then switched over to become a coach. And fast forward, I coached the ladies team. We won a world championship in 83. And then I became the men's coach for the 1988 Olympics in Seoul, Korea. So that's the short version of a part of my life, which was wonderful, traveled the world, got to see all kinds of things. But now it's sort of to another horror, which is the horror that we like nowadays.
Yeah, so I mean, and you're doing teaching while you're coaching Olympic teams. Even if you're not participating in the sport, that seems like a lot to be doing all at once.
Well, that some parts of that coaching was not paid. Back in those days, it was all amateur stuff. So I'm teaching at a private school, residential school. I bring the athletes onto my campus outside of Toronto, where we're actually using the swimming pool and the track. And we're doing our fencing there. We go to a stable nearby. So I was able to sort of leverage my position as a school teacher. But when I did most of the coaching was on holidays when I was going off being paid by somebody else to do it. But the combination of teaching and coaching went together really quite well.
Okay. And just before we get back onto the kind of horror track of it all, with doing the Olympic sort of coaching and being there in the Olympic Village, can you just tell us a bit about just being there at the Olympics? That's just such a rare opportunity.
Well, having worked at Olympics in 76 and being boycotted out of 80 and then finally getting to go in 88, it was pretty spectacular to finally meet a goal and get on an airplane and fly to Seoul, Korea. And you're there for 3 weeks to a month before the event actually starts. Not many people know that. You've got to acclimatize, get used to the food, the time zones, you get to practice in the sites. And that whole time you're wandering around trying to stay focused on what you're doing. And in my case, trying to keep my 3 athletes focused. And then you've got these star athletes that you've read about and seen about wandering around. And especially, hormones are rampant, trying to keep my boys, in a tight leash to stay focused as well. Luckily, in our case, the modern pentathlon was the first 4 days of the Olympics. So we had the opening ceremony, got to march in those, 100,000 people in the stands. It's wonderful. But all but 2 of my guys sat in the stands because they didn't want their legs too tired for the next day. And so we had to take it easy. But once the event was over, we got to stay for the next 2.5 weeks to really enjoy the Olympics and make up for lost time with all those other events that we could talk about another time.
All the things you were trying to stop your boys from doing before.
Yes, exactly. Exactly.
Now, so where do you get from then finishing your kind of Olympic journey, if you will, to going, picking up the thread with your great granduncle?
Well, I moved, I married a lady from South Carolina in the U.S., So that brought me to the US where I was teaching. So that sort of, it was a time to start a family. We had our first child, and I decided to put modern pentathlon to rest. And that's when I actually got into the game of real tennis, which we can get into later. But your question was, how did this whole digging into Bram become a reality? 2003, I got a phone call from a film producer and a screenwriter from New York who had an idea, and that he'd had a screenplay that never really went anywhere. And he said, I think I should, sort of do things backwards, turn it into a book, as opposed to take a book and turn it into a screenplay. And it was an interesting take on the type of Dracula that was featured in the 1992 Coppola movie, Bram Stokers Dracula. It was a more sympathetic Vlad the Impaler turned into, a vampire. And at that time, that movie was really popular. And so I had loved it. And so I thought, okay, I'll get on board, but I'm not just going to throw my name on this. I'm going to get into the story, contribute to the writing. And I said, and I want Bram Stoker to be a character in the book. Wouldn't that be a cool idea to have a sequel to the novel, this very famous novel, that actually has Bram Stoker in it? And then so we shuffle the deck, change things around, and that made me embark on about a year of digging around, going to Philadelphia, where the Dracula notes were, Trinity College in Dublin, where many other papers are, and learning as much as I could from some relatives, Bram's great-grandsons, and others about what was Bram Stoker like. So that was really the genesis point, was sort of writing a book. And then from then, I just haven't stopped. I've been going solid since about 2003.
And had you done any writing before, or was it just like you got this opportunity and you thought, well, I'm going to do this?
With that's another question that's asked a lot. Absolutely. I've never done any formal writing, just casual keeping diary, writing lots of reports about children at schools. But nowadays, even someone like me can write, and you can get an editor to help. And, Ian Holt and I actually sort of joked. It was like, okay, we send this off to our editor, and you get all these things back with red marks on it. We felt like, schoolboys again, being slapped on the wrist. So that was a difficult experience, especially being somebody that is usually pretty good in what you're doing, having to be a little more humble and accepting, which I was, obviously, of all sorts of help in the world of literature, which I wasn't very strong in. But, ideas come out, and we can get good help to make them a reality. And that's really what it was.
Do you think there was a lot of the drives which you'd taken from the world of Olympics, which helped you kind of have the tenacity to kind of make yourself into a writer? Because that's not a small feat to do that from the ground up and to take on that advice, because a lot of people can be very resistant when they're learning a new skill to kind of take on the criticism and the feedback.
Well, Squee, I'm glad you said that, because here I am for, sort of 20 years trying to teach children, middle school and high school, and older people in the pentathlon new skills, or to refine skills. And now I've got to, the shoes are on the other foot, and I've got to accept the same. But the fact is, the tenacity was there. I mean, getting up early in the morning and swimming for 2 hours, early in the morning, staying at, late, doing training in different places, sticking with it, as we say. In a way, it was very similar, because it's like, I'm going to get this done. I'm just going to get back to it and work at it and work at it. The one thing I say is that in some ways, the people that watch you in sport are a lot more gentle on you with either your successes or your failures than the people that review your books. Because one of the hardest things for me was not competing in a world championship or a Canadian championship or something like that with the chance of success or failure, but it was waiting for that first review from Amazon or from the rejection letters from publishers. That was harder to take than putting yourself out there in front of 50,000 people, where you could trip and fall.
So I guess it's kind of a thing of I'm guessing by this stage you know yourself as somewhat of an athlete and as a coach, but it's kind of getting to trust yourself as right and like build up the credibility just to yourself, if no one else.
And it's a self-confidence thing, and it's a strange thing, but I felt when I was going through this, that Bram Stoker experienced the same thing. His childhood was marred by a serious illness the first 7 years of his life.
Yeah.
And his recovery was based on his long distance walking. That's how he built himself up. And he went through a very strange sort of growth spurt. I didn't, but Bram Stoker did. He grew to be very tall, tallest one in his family, big man. And I believe his successes at Trinity in a wide variety of sports, everything from rugby, race walking, gymnastics, rowing, those things created the self-confidence in him to then go become the head of the Philosophical Society, the auditor of the Historical Society, and then delve into writing, where, as you say, you put yourself out there for people to review you or to sort of mark you. And it was a strange parallel, but I sort of felt at the same time as I was doing it. It was almost like, well, gosh darn it, if Bram Stoker can do this, I can do it. And I'm going to try to do the best I can, even though there's multiple failures and rejections, get back up again, and let me bring him to light. You know, people knew Dracula, but they didn't know Bram. And that kept motivating me to bring his story to light.
And was there one thing that you found early on which made you think, oh, brilliant, I should dig into this further? Or were you just kind of so driven as a researcher?
There was one thing in particular, and it still nags me. It really was the driving factor in writing Dracula with J.D. Barker, and it was part of my pitch was, Bram had this strange childhood illness for 7 years. I believe from the research that I did, because he had an uncle that was a famous fever doctor who did bloodletting, that he probably bloodlet Bram, which probably led to some horrifying experiences for 7 years. But what was strange was that at the age of 7, he had a miraculous recovery. Nobody knows what the illness was. Nobody knows exactly how he recovered. And that, combined with my knowledge of sport about, well, I know how people recover in my day. They're taking all kinds of, growth hormones and steroids and things. That's, illegal stuff that's going on in this other world I'm in. What could have happened in 1847 to 1852 in Bram Stoker's life? And that allowed me to do what a lot of authors do. And I sort of felt I had become an author when I sat down with a friend of mine and talked about what if. What if Bram Stoker had reason to believe that vampires were real, and he came to that conclusion because something in that world caused him to recover from his childhood illness. And that sort of what if just sort of grew and grew. And I started taking notes, and I started connecting other dots to other pieces of his life. Oh, maybe that's why he did this. Maybe why. So if I can connect those, and most importantly, convince J.D. Barker to drink that Kool-Aid and believe that, and then his creative juices started going. And that's how we came up with Dracula, the story of Bram, this seed planted because of his miraculous recovery from unknown illness, to then why he might have written Dracula as a novel, as a warning to the world that novel is all about Dracula being real.
It's genius. And it's so amazing. The more I hear about kind of this stuff that you look back into for Bram's life, the parallels with your life and his, and kind of maybe some of the drives and motivations, which kind of speaks to the thing which we always wonder, is it nature or nurture with people? But it's also how Bram himself, it sounds like from everything you found out, nothing was just kind of like just put in there randomly. It seems like everything was motivated and had some ancestry and stuff which actually happened in his life. So he was obviously a great observer himself of life.
I think he was. One of the things that I picked up during the research for the first book I wrote with Ian Holt, Dracula Undead, that came out in 2009. Bram has got 2 great grandsons. One lives on the Isle of Wight and the other near Oxford. And the one, the Isle of Wight being the elder, has most of the papers. And I was made aware that he had a journal of Bram's. And this journal, other than the Dracula notes that had been discovered in the Rosenbach Museum, this journal was the first thing anybody's ever found at source that Bram has written. And it was an 11-year period while he was still a student at Trinity and working at Dublin Castle. And then he got his big break and moved to London. So reading that journal made me very, very aware of Bram's sort of position in life, his view of life, and that he was somebody very, very aware of everything going on around him. He was interested in, the social plight of women, of people drinking a lot, and how much the drink really messes up families and so on. There was other political and political situation between England and Ireland. There was sport, there was partying, there was humor. There was even a few precursors to Dracula. He actually made a really cool little entry. I once knew a little boy who kept so many flies in a jar they had no room but to die. And to me, that was a light precursor to him creating his character Renfield many years later. So it was that journal that did exactly as you asked, is what kind of a guy was Bram? How did I learn about it? It was in this journal. And that gave me another layer of understanding this man as I then read every letter he wrote, read other things people wrote about him. I could go back to, yes, that's what Bram was really getting at. That's the kind of guy he was.
Because I found it, what I really loved about your Talking Great Yarmouth was we did hear about how everything which you're, because some stuff, obviously you have to make some supposition if you don't have direct evidence from Bram of how he's kind of like, how he's used that influence. But all yours was so well realized, so well kind of connected in. Like I've seen, you see some people whose ancestors might have been someone famous, and there's a lot of kind of like just very sort of flimsy put together. You've like really pieced it together well. But to actually find something in Bram's own writing must just be and did anything that you found of his back up anything which you previously supposed?
Well, I think as you mentioned a good analogy. It is like a puzzle coming together. As I would read these 5 different biographies that have been published since the early 1962 was the first one, I believe, and so I'd read that and I realized, okay, this guy Harry Ludlam only had this information at his disposal to write this biography. And then I would be able to find other pieces of information that have been discovered in different archives and libraries, museums. And that started Barbara Belford to write hers, and somebody else wrote another one, and so on. So I could take this holistic look and realize that I may not have been the guy that put all the pieces, that found all the pieces, but I can put them together because I have one of the final pieces, which is this journal. And then that made me look at the Dracula notes, 125 pages of actual notes that Bram wrote and were sold through auction and made their way to the Rosenbach Museum. And then the Dracula typescript that only, to my knowledge, 6 other authors have been able to look at, that the Microsoft co-founder Paul Allen, his estate now owns out in Seattle. I could then take all those pieces and then apply it to, what do we find in this 485 pages of Dracula with lots of things marked out. So there wasn't one thing in particular, Squee. It was more, I can now apply a holistic look to Bram's life and all of his writing. And some of them do pop up, like some of his short stories pop up in just little entries, or even a letter that he wrote to somebody and there was a mention of something in it. Oh yeah, maybe that's where he got that idea from. But it does really help when you want to come and make and write a story, that you've got a really good picture of what makes this guy tick. And then you can take some artistic license and have some fun with it.
I think there's also something about, we've all got like Dracula and the works of Bram that he chose for people to see. But what some writes when they don't know someone's watching, I think really informs you about them in a just slightly different way.
Yeah, right now, actually, I'm working with one of the top Dracula scholars in the world, Robert 18 Basang, on an annotated Dracula. So that's pushing me to read all the other annotated Draculas and finding out what other people think about it. And so I look at these things and I wonder, like, I'm taking a passage, for instance, a very legal passage, and I'm not sure if their viewers how well aware they are of the novel, but from legal opinions rendered in Dracula. One of them was when Lucy's mother died, and her will was written in a way that Arthur Holmwood actually got her estate, not her daughter. But it only would have happened if the mother predeceased the daughter, which actually happened in the novel 5 minutes earlier. So that is Bram Stoker, the legal eagle, as we call them over here. He was called to the bar in London to become a lawyer, and yet he chose not to practice. He had enough sort of legal work to do at the Lyceum Theatre. But that's the legal side of Bram. He did the same thing in Whitby when the ship, the Demeter, crashed on Tate Sands. It was a derelict ship, and the authorities run on the ship to try to figure out who's legally got possession of the boxes of dirt. Now, there's a sentence that says a young law student comes onto the boat and sets everybody straight and says, that because the hand of the captain is on the steering wheel, the rules are such. Now, had that legal opinion not been rendered, there would have been a question about, well, all these boxes of dirt, they're not going to be allowed to be shipped off to London to the houses that Dracula wanted. They're now possession of the Coast Guard. So this is just one example of understanding Bram and his background and how he inserts these things into Dracula. I don't think really with any great cause or mission. It's just the way he is when no one's looking. He just decides to render some legal opinions. That's just one of these many examples.
That's brilliant. And so to take it back a bit, so let's go through the kind of like the journey of you kind of discovering this information and how it all came up. So you've got this call to be part of this book. What's the kind of first thing you do? Like, do you just book the flight over to Dublin, or what's the best?
No, the first thing was like, wow, this is something way out of the norm that I have never done. First thing is I want to get my family's approval. Because if I'm going to become sort of the family spokesman, the one guy that represents us in having a Stoker back in this Dracula franchise. So there's one uncle who has sort of been in my family, Paddy Stoker, that was sort of the keeper of the papers, and I contacted him, and he said, "Oh, by all means." He said, "The same guy contacted me, but I wanted nothing to do with it. I'm too old, not creative enough. I'm glad you're doing it, Dacre." So
that's so weird, like to think that something that became such a focus in your life,
yeah,
if another relative had chosen to take it up, your whole life changes just like that.
Well, it is, but Uncle Paddy said, "This is not for me, but Dacre, you need to come up here to Montreal," this is from South Carolina, "and start looking through all my archives, because I said, I want to be able to represent Bram as well as I can." He had things from our grandfather, my great grandfather, and his grandfather, George Stoker, Bram's youngest brother. They were very close. So I got some information there. Then I booked a flight to go with my wife to Philadelphia to the Rosenbach Museum to look at the Dracula notes, because at that time they hadn't been published. So the only way to read them was to request authority to go and study them, which took sort of 2 days. So those two moves were the first ones. And then, of course, I had to, in the meantime, on the airplane, reading Dracula again to make sure, I'm back up to speed with it. So that started the whole ball rolling, was family permission and the pilgrimage to the Rosenbach Museum to look at the notes, study them, and rereading Dracula for the 5th or 6th time.
So it sounds like you were very conscious from the get-go that this was going to be you taking responsibility for the family's legacy in the way the world might see Bram from a personal view of the family.
I'm well aware when you look at relatives of famous people in all sorts of genres, you get accused of riding the coattails of somebody famous and not adding to, bringing something to rather than taking away. That's never been me as a sportsman, as a teacher. So I wanted to make sure that even if I went overboard, which I'm sure I do, but you can see the library behind me. My wife tried, not another Dracula book, not another biography, not another. Yes, I've got to be, got to be as much of an authority as I can be on this, or at least understand it. So yes, to represent the family, I wanted to do as good a job as I possibly could. And that meant endless research. And it wasn't long after that that there was actually a really neat event in Dublin called One City, One Book, where they were actually, the public library, the Dublin City Library, was actually studying Dracula for the month. So what they do is they highlight in all the schools at different levels the novel Dracula. Even young kids maybe drawing little pictures, older ones reading a comic book, and they get older, and then you get to the people interpreting Dracula on stage and so on. That has since turned into the Bram Stoker Festival in Dublin. But at the time, 2009, my wife and I flew over to Dublin, and we actually, we actually met a lot of the folks that were running the Bram Stoker Society in Dublin. And those were some people that knew a lot more than I did. So I was sort of, okay, having lunch with one, tell me as much as you can. Where do I find more information? That was a great source of resource for me.
It's great. So you fly over there to Ireland. Like, where do you even begin?
Staying in a hotel. It was really interesting. It was staying in a hotel, sort of right in the middle of the city, and meeting friends in this, and relatives, mind you, to say, you've got to take me around to the important places. So one of them, a Douglas Appleyard, is wonderful. He's sort of like my Uncle Paddy was in Canada. He was the one in Dublin. And he'd written a few books for his church about different areas of influence in Dublin. And he knew a lot of the Bram Stoker places, as did some of the members of the Bram Stoker Society, Trinity College, Dublin Castle, Marcia's Library, places where Bram worked, studied, lived, had an influence, and so on. And then attended lectures by Dr. Elizabeth Miller, who flew over, and the Romanian embassy actually put on a chat about Vlad the Impaler. So there was lots of things pretty much right in the middle of the city that kept me very, very busy. And then I'll never forget one of the actual 4 or 5 hour blocks was going to Trinity to look at the papers that Bram's grandsons and great-grandsons had actually given to Trinity. And there was some pretty interesting things. And one was a lock of hair of the nanny of the boys, of Bram's and Thornley's and George. So they actually had kept in an envelope, which I understand after looking at it now, it sounds not such a, not so strange, but back at the time it was like, oh my God, this is really weird. But apparently Victorians did that, keeping locks of hair. And that was the nanny who ended up getting featured in the book Dracula. So yeah, that was a really cool trip. And I've been back now many, many times, fortunate enough to be asked to give lectures at the Bram Stoker Festival. And my wife and I we've gone outwards to different parts of Ireland where George Stoker, my great-grandfather, was married to a family, the MacLachry, the Reeks in Killarney, where Bram's mother was raised in Sligo, where they had the horrible cholera epidemic that she wrote a story to Bram about. I wanted to find the source of all that information, how that may have affected his mind. So yeah, Ireland has been good for me.
So, I mean, I love the fact that you've even brought the nanny into your book. Like, just that level of kind of taking the influence. Again, it kind of like, say, it sounds like what Bram did, of just taking everything in his life and putting it in there. And you've done that in a very respectful way. Something you touched upon there was that when Nicola, my girlfriend, and I, well, fiance now, sorry, we just got engaged. So good save. And got engaged this week. By the way, thank you for all the wonderful well wishes from the SciFi Weekender family. Just quickly, but when we came into your talk, like we weren't aware of your kind of your work before, and like we did have that kind of nervousness about someone's relative telling the story when they, maybe hadn't done all that wonderful research you've done. But just to hear that you've even brought the nanny into your book is just lovely to hear. So I love all those details. So you've got those details. Like, is that what kind of everything that went into that first book, or is there some more you found out at that stage?
No, the other part, I mean, that's probably as much without boring you with like minor details, the big thing about that first book was it takes place 25 years after Dracula ends. And so what we had to do was take some leaps of faith that some readers absolutely loved, others didn't. And that was, what would have happened to the remaining characters after the story Dracula ends? And so we did a lot of research into the Victorian literature and the Victorian life and doctors turning into morphine addicts and so on. And so yeah, it made sense that, we had Dr. Seward, who the girl he wanted to marry, Lucy, was chosen by somebody else, but then they had to kill her. Yeah, I think it's fair to assume that he would be affected and possibly turn into a morphine addict. And we also decided to take this other vampire, Countess Elizabeth Bathory, and put her in the story. And I'm not going to say where to ruin it, but that probably wraps it up for that story. So it's a combination of finding things that are factually accurate from the story and how do we use them, to turning it into a work of fiction with things that are plausible and believable when we have our what if moments.
And I do want to talk to you some more about getting into that time, because that's the other thing, as well as knowing Bram's life backwards and forwards as you do. You've learned all about that time, and we'll get into that in a second, but we have got a question from the comments here. So Topcat 1701 has put, has anyone approached you about a film or TV adaptation of Dracula, and who would you cast in the roles?
Well, the good news is, yes, Dracula, the option for the film rights have been picked up by Paramount Warner Brothers. When we sold the actual book to publishers, they then extended those rights another 18 months. So they've got until, I think, June of 2021 to move on or pay us some more money. So yes, it's going to be really neat, I think, if they do it, to turn it into a movie. The problem is, when I get the question, who do you think should be Dracula? Well, I think Klaus Bang did a great job in the BBC adaptation. That adaptation has received, just sort of like Dracula, mixed reviews. Some people absolutely love it. Some people absolutely hate it. Some people hated Dracula the Undead because I changed things. Some people absolutely love it because you change things. One thing is consistent. Dracula in literature and in movies and in streaming means so much to so many people. You're never going to satisfy all of them, because there's such a passionate connection, and all of our imaginations go in different directions. So if they did a prequel, which Dracula was, do they go back to Gary Oldman, or is he over all that? I understand he's over all that, but maybe there's another fresh face, or maybe it's Klaus Bang. I'm not sure. And honest, I don't want to bias it, because I just hope they make the movie and choose somebody that does a really good job.
And if this virus has knocked filmmaking off by a few months, if you get some extra money out of it, so be it, eh?
Yeah, exactly. That could be one of the positive things.
But there's so much negative about COVID-19. We've got to take the positives where we can.
We've got to find, no, I mean, obviously there are things in contracts about force majeure, but if I'm sure JD and I and our agent will give them a pass if they actually have to ask for, 3 extra months or 5 extra months before they can make a decision. So we'll see. I just hope it happens.
Okay, we got another question from the floor. So Mr. Vols has put, what do you think of Dracula 2000's twist of Dracula being Judas?
It's funny. That's one of them I have not seen. And it's not, just people have to understand, I don't live my day catching up on all the movies. There's over 600 movies with the Dracula character, not just vampire movies, the Dracula, and I don't have time for that. That's one I haven't seen. But I think it's interesting, because I've heard people talk about this on panels about obviously the whole religious thing. I believe, and this is a big element of I update my Stoker and Stoker chat all the time. And one of them is recently, I've updated because of the discovery of the books in the London Library. And in those books in the London Library, there's a lot of references. And these are books that Bram actually read and listed in his research and went through and ticked off and underlined, as much as he shouldn't have done that, and made marks in those books all around the devil and influences of the devil in certain places in the world, like these desolate mountains of Transylvania and so on. So it doesn't take a rocket scientist to believe that Bram was looking for an ultimate evil, the devil, when he chose Vlad the Impaler. He also did something really, I think, using his dry sense of humor. Many people don't pick up on this, but one of the addresses where the boxes of dirt were sent in Whitechapel was to Count de Ville. Count Devil, like Cruella de Vil. So yes, to this person asked about Judas. Sorry, I haven't seen the movie, but there's definitely sort of this component of evil, good versus evil, Judas, the devil. Who knows? But other people can play with it and do those slight switches to Judas. It's all good. Very creative.
By the way, guys, please, if you have got any questions, do put them in the group, and we'll try to get to as many as we can. So there's more of a statement, but I'll kind of turn it into a bit of a question. So Flint Rock Orcs has put, Dracula is such a timeless story, you'd think it'd been around forever. So what do you think particularly lends to this story being so timeless and to kind of capture people's imagination still?
Well, I'm so glad. Frank, was it that said this?
Oh, no, it was Flint.
Flint. Okay. The concept has been around forever. The vampire in different cultures. Bram actually touched on that in the one interview that has ever been discovered. It was by Jane Stoddard in British Weekly, a British newspaper, that came out 3 months after Bram wrote Dracula. And she, where does this come from? He said, oh, it's a myth that has been in the Middle Ages and depopulated whole villages. So I decided to look into that, and then deeper in the interview, he listed 13 different countries that he found in whatever books he was looking at, and we now know the books are in the London Library, that had some version of a blood-sucking creature coming out of the grave that had been around forever. So that's why I believe it's so deep and resonates in so many people around the world. Bram just decided to give it an earthly figure, and he chose Vlad the Impaler because of references to two books, a Wilkinson book and a Samuelson book, to sort of bring this spirit, bring this myth to life, make it feel realistic. But that question/statement is a good one, because when you look at it from a scientific standpoint, I found about 12 treatises on the internet that were all about vampire scares in Europe, and they all coincided to different contagious diseases going through Europe at the same time, and people who were having a hard time coming to grips with what was causing these unexpected deaths. And at the time, religion wasn't giving the right answers, or the answers that they were happy with. They dug into superstition, and the easiest thing was creatures of the night. There's some sort of creature coming out of the grave. Somebody dies in a family, their body goes into the grave, and 2 days later, somebody else in the family is affected by a similar disease, and they think this vampire spirit of their father, whoever died earlier, has come out to suck life. And that's the sort of a really short version, but that's the concept we're dealing with here, Squee, and that's what Bram capitalized on by taking something that really scared the hell out of people for many, many, many years. He just brought it to life in his character, and that's why so many other people have had great success with it, with other stories.
Now, we've got a question here from Not Squeeze PA. Now, I don't know who that might be. It might be Nicola. Who knows? But she's asked, you've mentioned Elizabeth Bathroy. Yeah. Do you believe she was an influence on the creation of Dracula?
many people believe she was. She was, of course, a countess in this sort of Eastern Europe area, in the, and I can't remember exactly what country right now, if it was Hungary or Serbia or whatever. Somebody will correct me, so I won't try to get it, but somewhere in that area. But earlier in history than Vlad. But she was someone that bathed in the blood of young peasant girls, virgin girls, their blood would be pure, it would be young. So she was a blood bather. The question, though, is, was the history of Countess Elizabeth Bathory influential on Bram Stoker and his creation of Dracula? And I'd hate to be the sort of put on this boring air by saying, we don't know if he ever read anything about her. All we know is that there was 28 books listed at the end of his notes. And those books are in the London Library. None of those books have anything about Bathory. He could have read some other book that he didn't list in his research. He could have picked it up somewhere. He could have been sitting at a table chatting with somebody about it. I know that he was sitting at a table twice with Arminius Vanbury. I've got a record of him sitting at that table in the Beefsteak Club in the Lyceum Theater. Bram actually drew the seating arrangements, and I know the dates when those happened. And I believe that he, Arminius Vanbury, gave Bram information, gave him thoughts to consider. That when Bram went off to Whitby and found this book by William Wilkinson about Vlad the Impaler, that started the twig towards looking at a book by Samuelson and so on, that then put the book in Transylvania. Did he tell Bram anything about Bathory? We don't know for sure. So it makes great fodder for information, because they're both, Eastern European. Both of them were sort of enamored with blood. No records of either of them actually drinking blood, but Bram made that connection between these old treaties we were talking about, considering the vampire myth, and with real people that acted close to that, and he brought them together to make it feel, oh, that must be real.
And it's worth knowing that, any author, as honest as I'm sure they try to be, and all their kind of people who they credit, every writer is influenced by everything they come across. So, yes. Even if he didn't list it, doesn't mean that it is an influence. So good question by Not Squee's PA. I think she prefers to be called secretary. That's obviously what she's getting at there. So we've now got a question by Mad Girl Lolly 101. The diary entry writing aspect of Dracula captivated me as a teen who was into creative writing. Where do you think Bram got the idea to write like that? It's a very good question. At the time, Wilkie Collins was a writer, obviously much more famous than Bram, because he had written a number of books, but apparently he wrote a book using that style, the epistolary style. So it wasn't original, but it also was something that Bram did a lot himself. He kept a diary. He kept a journal. He wrote letters. He actually was a newspaper. He wrote articles in newspapers. So to me, it's a statement, Squee, that you just said. You do what comes natural. You take ideas that you get, sometimes organically, and it just works its way into a story. So I think Bram was the type of guy that sets out, I'm going to write the story in epistolary style because Wilkie Collins did, and that's something that everybody loved. I think it was the Woman in White story. I'm going to use that in my story. It's the only one of the 12 other novels that he wrote that he did in the epistolary style. But it came natural because he was doing that, and it was just this perfect sort of symbiotic move on his behalf. And it was a work of genius, because as you read the story, you go through this and you look at the different journal entries, the diaries, and different positions of the major characters in the story. And we, the reader, kind of figure out what's going on before all the characters do. And you're kind of sitting there reading, you idiot, there's a vampire there. Can't you see this person? So in a strange way, we, the reader, are putting these pieces of the puzzle together with the actual characters. And that's kind of what I'm doing as I'm understanding Bram. I'm studying forensically
Bram Stoker in an epistolary style, letters, journals, things, putting them together at the same time. That's why I love that question. Thank you for the person that sent it in.
Yeah, that was lovely. If anyone's got any other questions, please put them in and we'll try to get to them before the end of this. We've got 5 minutes though. If we don't get to this today, please do email drsquee@gmail.com and I will ask them in the part 2, which is going to be on the Facebook Live for the Dr. Squee show. Just putting that in there so people can continue this on. As I say, I just didn't want to rush this fascinating conversation. So one thing I want to kind of like go towards just quickly before we get to the end. Where you, so as I said before, you had to be as knowledgeable not only about Bram, but about the times which he lived in. You know, that seemed like a big thing which was important to you. Firstly, why was that so important to you? And secondly, was that something that came naturally to you? Were you already a history buff?
No, was not a history buff. Actually, was one of those that sort of resisted, history, like, oh God, that's all this old stuff that happened. I've got to get on with my sport and get on with things that are happening now and in the future. I got to train for this. So no, it wasn't. I slowly developed this sort of fascination with how can we understand things that happened back in, Bram was born in 1847. He wrote the book starting in 1890. He published in 1897. Well, thank God that the internet was created and I can sit at my home, back in the early, sort of 2009 and so on, and access things and look at maps, which I then began to really love, looking at the details of maps. Getting things right has always been something I've liked to do, little details, and it was something Bram did in his stories. So there was no way that Ian Holt and I could write a book involving Bram Stoker or even letting it stand close on a bookshelf to the novel Dracula, because so many details in that story were accurate, correct, and made the story special because it made the story feel real. And we needed to do the same. What we did was hire a guy called Alexander Gallant, who did this professionally in Toronto for TV shows and plays. He was a historian that had found ways to dig into places. So we would go to Alex and say, we need to have a chase scene in London or across France at this period of time. What modes of transportation were available? What was happening in Calais? What was happening in Paris? How far was the distance? How could somebody get there? And he would then click up a couple of different sources. We'd get these links. We would look at them, and then we didn't have Skype and Zoom at the time. We'd be on our phones, and each of us would have the link, and we're looking on our computers going, okay, what about this? Okay, you write this part, I'll write this. So it would have been easier today, as it was for JD and I doing Dracula, but it's a whole lot less cheaper than having to fly to these places and dig around. I mean, I have so much respect for people like Ken Follett, who I love to read his stuff, who would have had to have written all these historically accurate novels by being there in person. To figure out all the right details and places and bridges and subway systems and how they all worked and so on.
Well, something we'll have to get onto in part 2. I am actually so glad that the internet wasn't so sophisticated when you started on this journey, because I think if it wasn't for you to go to the places and experience them, I think there's nothing which compares to that. And I'm so glad you went to that effort and you did that, because it shines through in your work.
Well, you've got to, I think that the internet helps me get the first leg into it, but there's nothing like walking around Dublin after a rain and nighttime and smelling and feeling and experiencing, opening the same doors that Bram did at Marsh's Library, going through the same rows of books and pulling out the same books that Bram did. I totally agree with you, but that way you can at least do your initial research on the internet and then pick and choose where you've got to go and live and breathe it.
Well, guys, you've got some wonderful questions you posted here. I'm sorry, we're not going to get to them right now. As I say, please do follow us at the Dr. Squee Show page on Facebook. And if you follow the podcast, Dr. Squee, on your favorite podcatcher, we'll be posting up the full, 2 parts put together in one interview later. But Bram, Dacre.
That's a compliment. That's a compliment.
Yeah. Dacre, in the meantime, I just have to say how many people have been saying how fantastic you were at Great Yarmouth at the last in-person SciFi weekend. Had loads of compliments saying you're wonderful talk are then wonderful here right now, and they can't wait for part 2. I'm getting the feeling of. But where can they find all your stuff online right now?
Well, the first thing is I've been invited to come back in 2021 to Great Yarmouth. So really excited. I'm allowed to say that. You can find information. Follow me on Facebook. You can also find me dacrestoker.com. And I'll tell you one of the latest cool things, you can go to the Dracula store on Etsy, and you'll see some really cool items from vintage book covers and Dracula's notes and so on that a friend of mine have put into place, to give that real old vibe on certain products people may like. But I think Facebook is the best place to converse with me. Every now and then I get to that 5,000 level. I've got to cut some people out, but contact me that way. And I love to answer the questions. And I really look forward to next weekend. We'll pick up where we left off, Squee.
That's great. Same time next weekend?
Sounds good.
See you next Saturday at the Dr. Squee Show page. But for tonight, you guys have got a wonderful night in store. You've got Level Up Leroy coming up. You've got the quiz just in a minute. And you've got the Jolly Boat guys, as well as just a wonderful evening worth of entertainment. Thank you so much to SciFi and Sky for having us here as part of the lineup. And thank you, Mr. Dacre Stoker.
Well, thank you, Mission Control, for making this happen, because this is amazing, isn't it? We can do this from South Carolina and UK and make this all together. So good luck for the rest of the weekend, you guys.
And I don't think I'll ever top having the Sci-Fi Weekender right here in my front room, or my studio at least.
Okay.
So glitz and glamour on the way out. Enjoy the rest of your evening, guys. Back to the studio. I hope this is going to go now.